I find it interesting that one of the earliest things children learn to say is, "That's not fair." Probably number 3 after no and gimme. And usually "that's not fair" comes out when one of their brothers or sisters gets a larger piece of food than they do, or their siblings get special privileges because they're older that they don't get to experience yet. That's not fair. And children are very good at expressing what's on their mind and how they're feeling. But even though as adults we may not verbalize the same sentiment out loud, there are those times when we have thought to ourselves or felt to ourselves, "That's not fair. That's not fair. I worked so hard and they got the promotion. That's not fair. I did everything right and my life is falling apart. That's not fair. Like, God, I've been faithful to you. I've been trying to trust you, follow you, and now I'm dealing with that diagnosis. That's not fair. I gave everything to that relationship. I poured my heart out for that, and now I'm the one that's hurt. That's not fair. I'm trying to do my best as a parent. I'm trying to do all the right things for my kids, and I feel like I'm failing. That's not fair. I prayed, nothing happened. What I love about the Bible, though, is it doesn't gloss over these kind of feelings and thoughts that we have in our minds, but it puts us right in the middle of the struggle. And as I was thinking about this passage, it made me think about Hannah from the Bible. Hannah shows up in a book called 1 Samuel. It's really the story about the beginning of the people of Israel getting a king and a monarchy, but it opens with a zoom in focus on this one woman's life, Hannah, and she was a godly woman. She loved God and was following him, and she was stuck in a tragic situation, for she was not her husband's only wife. He had 2. Not ideal, but often in ancient times, men would sometimes have multiple wives, which caused many, many, many issues, especially in the family dynamics of the home. But not only was she in this polygamous arrangement, but she was also struggling with infertility. She was unable to get pregnant, and having children in the ancient world was the pride and joy of a woman. The more children you had, the more esteem that you had in society, and to be barren, to be infertile was to have great shame and to not be fulfilling your vocation according to the societal narrative at the time. But even worse than that, not only was she unable to get pregnant, but also because she wasn't pregnant, she was facing the scorn from the other wife who was giving the husband children. And it says this in 1 Samuel 1:6, her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. That's not fair. I'm trying to follow you, God. I'm loving you, God. I'm trying to be faithful to my husband. And the one thing that I know that you like, God is a God of life and not death. It's a good blessing to have children. You are withholding that from me. What I also find extremely interesting, though, is we know that it's because the Lord closed her womb. But that's an interpretive comment for us to know as readers. She didn't know that. She didn't see the divine plan of what was happening in her life. All she felt and all she experienced was shame, was being provoked by her rival, was the seeming unfairness of life, that she didn't do anything wrong, and yet she was stuck in this situation. And it's those kind of things where Kohelet, the author, the preacher, the wise sage of Ecclesiastes, situates his narrative here. He puts us right in the middle of those struggles, right in the middle of those feelings, right in the middle of those situations where we don't know why it's happening or what's happening, or even though we're trying to do everything the right way, things just aren't working out for us like we want them to. It is right in the middle of that Kohelet drops us in this passage. And yet, even though there's that seeming unfairness of life, he points us to something greater. And so if we were to summarize this section of Scripture this morning, it could be summarized in this way. Life under the sun isn't fair, but God is still worthy of your fear. Life under the sun isn't fair, but God is still worthy of your fear. And so Kohelet doesn't just tell us that life is unfair. He goes to show and makes these observations as he's living life, as he's walking down the street, as he's going through these things. He's observing what's happening around him, and he's pointing out all the seeming unfairness of this world. And the first thing that he points out is the unfairness of death. The unfairness of death. But he starts in a slightly different place. He starts by pointing out the rampant injustice that is in life. He says in verse 16, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness." So Kohelet is observing how life works, and the place that should uphold justice, things like the court system, things like law enforcement, things like where we would go and expect there to be fairness and goodness, he's saying that there is wickedness. It's topsy-turvy in this world. If you remember back, the key word in this book is hevel, or vanity. And there's three meanings to it that he uses in this book. That life is fleeting, we don't last. Life is futile, the things we chase don't last. And life is absurd, meaning what we think should happen doesn't happen. And that's what's happening here. All of us have this intuitive sense of justice. That's why we say, that's not fair. We all have an intuitive sense of basic right and wrong in life. And we think that if someone does wrong, they should be punished for it. If someone commits a crime, they should go to jail for it. But what Kohelet is pointing out here is those that commit the crime get off. Those that should be punished are praised. And in fact, justice and righteousness are downplayed while wickedness is exalted. Life can be topsy-turvy in how we think about it, and what we think should happen doesn't happen. He goes on to point out the all-pervasive nature of oppression in chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed. There was no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, but there was no one to comfort them." And Kohelet is pointing out the all too common and the all too human phenomenon, right, of the powerful and the rich to exploit the powerless and the poor. And that's what oppression is leveraging your power, leveraging your position to exploit others, to treat them unfairly, to keep them down, to advantage yourself while you push others down. But in Scripture, it is the fool, if you read the book of Proverbs, it is the fool that seeks to enrich himself at the expense of the community. And it is the righteous person that seeks to enrich the community at the expense of himself or herself. In fact, our statement of faith, that when you become a member here, that what you sign off on is an article on Christian living. Right? We want to live out the gospel, have it transform us, and then live it out. And the things that our statement of faith encourage us to live is that we show compassion to the poor and seek justice for the oppressed, because it is a biblical category to work for justice. Justice is giving people what they are due, and in the most common system, the criminal justice system, it is giving them what they're due. If they're guilty, it is a punishment. But because we are all made in God's image, there are certain things that all people are due, like inherent dignity, value, and respect, and we must work towards those things as believers. We are to be salt and light, as Jesus says, in our communities. We are to shine light on darkness and bring hope to hopeless places. We are to be salt, which was like a preservative back in the ancient world, where we can preserve society and make our communities, our neighborhoods, our families, our workplaces a better place. God has given us the task as his image bearers and the task of work to make a positive difference in the world. We are to be working towards those, to be moving towards those that are oppressed. And notice it says they had no one to comfort them. How can you solve problems in this world? All you need to do is look around and you will see injustice, you will see oppression, you will see brokenness all around you. And there's not a one-size-fits-all category for this. Each of us has a unique calling from the Lord, where God will often lay things on your heart to move towards in whatever field that you are in, and you can move towards those things to make a difference there. But the reality is that injustice and oppression are rampant in this broken world because our world is stained with sin. It is laboring under the curse of sin. The Bible talks about the human condition and how we are totally depraved. That doesn't mean that we're as bad as we could be, but it means every part of our humanness is stained and affected by sin, and this world is totally broken. Every part of it is stained and broken by sin. But even worse, in the very heart of this passage, Kohelet points out the utter unfairness of death. He says in verse 19 and 20, "What happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from dust, and to dust all return." What makes death so grievous is because in this passage, what he's saying is that those that perpetuate injustice and oppression, it's a sandwich technique. The beginning and the end of the passage match each other, and then in the heart is the meat of what he's getting at. What makes injustice so aggravating to us, so lamentable to us, is that sometimes the wicked get away with it because we all die. Sometimes human justice is limited and partial, and that person that perpetuated great atrocities, they're not brought to trial in this lifetime. That's what makes death feel so unfair. Because sometimes we don't see earthly justice. So why is Kohelet pointing this out? Why do we have to step into the icy shower this morning and just get hit in the face with this, that the world is filled with oppression, it's filled with injustice, and we all die like animals? Well, I think these are important things because we need to unwind our heart from certain expectations about how we think life will go or should go for us. I think he's pointing this out, number one, so that we're not naive about life. One of the things that was often told to my generation when I was in high school and in college is, you can change the world. And then we grew up and we found out, no, you can't. Right? Don't be naive about life. Don't go through life thinking that everything is supposed to work out exactly as it should, or exactly as we want it to be. He's saying you need to be aware of these things. And we need to be aware that injustice and oppression are real and that people are sinners and take advantage of others, because sometimes this naivety can infect our own thinking about other people, and we look at them and we say, well, they're poor. They must have done something wrong. They must be lazy, or they must be whatever. Or we look at others and we think, wow, their kids are a mess. They must not be real Christians. They must not just be trying hard enough. Because we have this naivety in life where we think, if I do X, I will receive Y. But Ecclesiastes is saying that's not always the case. Because there's injustice and oppression in the world, those that take advantage of others. Sometimes people are not succeeding because of the sin of other people. But I think in a strange roundabout way as well, Kohelet is telling us not to be embittered towards life either. I'm sure you've run into those that are the super cynical, person, and they're not pleasant to be around. No one likes bitter, cynical people. The problem is that cynicism is just naivety that got punched in the mouth. That's what the cynical person is like. And so he's saying, don't be embittered by the world. Because if you know what the world is like, you can be realistic and not bitter. And you can move through the world knowing that God is there with us through it all, even though it is still broken. It reminds me of the author Bruce Tift. He's a psychologist, writes on relationships, but he's joked that his marriage doesn't experience problems because he expects problems in his marriage. And that's how I think we can face life and not be embittered by it, is knowing that life is going to have problems. It's like doing home projects, right? Nothing ever works out like it should. You always got to make those 5 trips to Lowe's. But when you add that in to the time of the project and say it's just going to be a couple more days, then you can be a little bit more relaxed and at peace about things. And that applies to across life. If you go into it knowing there will be brokenness, there will be sin, there will be setbacks, we can face it with hope, with patience, and deliberate progress. But we're not going to be taken aback by when we experience life pressing in on us and injustice or things not going our way. I gotta admit this, that I was naive. In many ways. And then I started being deeply involved in the community. Because for most of my life, I've been in church. I grew up in church. I was homeschooled until I went to public high school, but then I went to a Christian college, and then I went to seminary, which is grad school for pastors, and then I came here, and I've been working here. I grew up in this church my whole life. I've been around believers for the vast majority of my life, and when you're working and rubbing shoulders with Christians, sure, we're messed up, and we still sin. And there's great dysfunction as well, but generally there's a shared basis of truth that we can lying is bad, right? And treating others and manipulating them and trying to exploit them, not great. There's usually the shared moral universe. And then I started working deeply in the community, rubbing shoulders with non-believers. I was naive. And I found out, okay, the world is a little bit different place. And some of you are like, duh. But yes, I know, because you've been in the world and your job for decades, okay? Cut me a break. But that was invaluable experience to learn. And that has shaped, I think, how I think about things as well. But when we're not naive about life, we can also be a little bit more hopeful about life because we don't need to give into bitterness because we know that this world is broken and we're not looking to it to give us things that it can't deliver. So there's an unfairness of death. But there's also this unfairness of work that he gets into in verses 4 through 12. He says in verse 4, I saw all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. Now clearly he's speaking hyperbolically here because he's saying all work is motivated by greed. That's essentially what he's saying. And that's not necessarily true, but from a hyperbolic perspective, it is because so many people are motivated by that way. But there's also this drive that happens in our hearts as well where we see other people succeeding, and rather than rejoicing with them, we hope that they fail. Or maybe we begin to be jealous of their success and we say, man, I wish that was my success. And sometimes that pushes us harder than we need to really go, or we work longer than we really should be because we're motivated. I want to get ahead. I need this validation in my life. And so I need to accomplish something great. And if I can do that, then I'll feel good about myself. But there's an unfairness that works there because sometimes you can work so hard and it doesn't turn out as you planned. Which is why we get so depressed and discouraged when other people succeed or we see our hard work come to naught. He says this in verses 7 and 8, speaking about the so-called workaholic. He says, again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. This is the person that's locked in, and they're just so focused on where they're going and where they're headed and what their career is like, and they're amassing all of this wealth and all of this privilege and all of this prestige and all of these accomplishments, and then at the end of the day, they never have the sense on the journey to look up and ask themselves, why am I working so hard? What am I doing this all for? They look up at the end of the decades and they find that there is no one around them. There's no relationships, there's no friendship, there's no one to share the joys of life with. And isn't that unfair? What I think he's getting at here is sometimes our hard work doesn't pay off. Especially if we have the wrong motive and the wrong focus and the wrong reason of why we're doing what we're doing. And so work itself is not the source of ultimate fulfillment, and it can be a source of great unfairness in our life. But he also points out the unfairness of legacy here at the end of chapter 4. In verse 13, he says, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he, I think this is talking about the poor and wise youth, for he went from the prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity, a striving after the wind. This is the Rudy of leadership, the David and Goliath of leadership, this poor, wise youth who apparently has spent time in prison, makes it the underdog story of the century. makes it all the way to the throne and displaces the old foolish king. He now has this vast empire. It says that there was no end of all the people that he led. And yet what happens to him in verse 16? Those that come later will not rejoice in him. No one remembers who he is. It's a callback to chapter 1, verse 11, where Kohelet says there is no remembrance of former things. We often don't know our great-grandparents' names. They're forgotten, and so will we. And so you're working so hard to build this legacy, to pass this on to someone, to make a name for yourself. And what he's saying here is it's all going to be forgotten. Those that come after you, they're not even going to remember who you are. And so why is he doing this? Why is Kohelet standing over a grave and pointing out, that's where you're going to end up? Why is Kohelet in the back of the break room smoking? Be like, man, why are you working so hard? Why is Kohelet standing dejected and at a distance from the crowds when they're chanting, long live the king, long live the king? Because he's trying to breed in us some holy disillusionment. Holy disillusionment, that we stop looking for the things under the sun. We stop looking for the things of this world. We stop looking for the things of our everyday life and turning to them for meaning and significance, but instead turn our eyes to the one who can give it, which is the Lord. He's reiterating this point that life, it may be unfair, but God is still worthy of your fear. He is the all-consuming reality of our lives. And so as he turns to chapter 5, he is reminding us that life, it's uncontrollable. It's enigmatic. We can't fully understand it. We don't know why what happens in our lives and in the world at large. We can't predict what will happen tomorrow, but much less next year. We're unable to rein life in and keep it under our control. And if life is so wild and so unpredictable and so much larger than ourselves, even though we try to make it small and controllable, but if it is so wild and so enigmatic and so uncontrollable, if that's what life is like, how much more the God that made it? And so if we are able to turn our eyes from a focus on this life to a focus on the Lord, we need to approach him, though, the right way. The only way to make it through this broken world filled with injustice, oppression, work that doesn't pan out, and a legacy that doesn't last is to live authentically and sincerely before the Lord. Stop playing games. That's what Kohelet is saying here in verse 1 of chapter 5. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. He's referencing back to the temple in Israel where people would have had to climb the steps to go worship, and he's saying, watch out, watch yourself. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that what they are doing is evil. He's saying if you're coming to use God, you're committing heinous evil. You're walking up the steps to the temple. You're walking into church and you're thinking, this is for my benefit. I'm going to leverage God for my own gain. Or I want to be seen as a respectable person. Kohelet is saying, do not do that. We need to approach God with reverence and awe for who he is. He says in verses 2 and 3, do not be rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Let your words be few, for a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. What he's getting at here is that we're just saying stuff. We're just running our mouths. We are imagining, well, this is what life is really like, and if you just do this, then you'll have success. And, he's saying, why are you doing that? You don't know. We are so small compared to the God of heaven. And so we need to live authentically and sincerely before him, reverently. He says in verses 4 and 5, when you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. How many times do we have the mindset, God, get me out of this. I'll go back to church. I'll start reading the Bible. I'll raise my kids the right way. I'll get them involved. And then things turn out all right for us, and we're like, all right, I'm just going to do my own thing now again. Thanks, God. Or we say, God, I'm going to stop doing this. God, I'm going to stop doing that. And this time, I mean it. That's foolish behavior. Because we're being duplicitous before the Lord. We're trying to leverage him for our own selfish desires. We're seeking to use God as our own personal assistant to enhance our life. Is that what God is all about, though? The one that spoke the world into existence with the word of his power, does he exist to be your personal assistant? And so he says in verses 6 and 7, let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messengers that it was a mistake. Oh, I didn't mean it, God, I didn't mean it. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? When dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. The way you make it through this broken world is fear of God, which is a visceral response of respect towards him. He's saying, don't be Christ adjacent, be Christ centered. Fear God, respect him, and live authentically before him. Get rid of all pretense, get rid of all show, get rid of all duplicity, get rid of all outward appearances, get rid of all, I act this way on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, I'm going to do my own thing. Get rid of all of that and come sincerely before him. And this reminds me of Hannah's response to him. As she is deeply distressed, as she is facing the scorn of her rival, as she's experiencing the injustice and the unfairness of life, what does she do? It says in 1 Samuel 1, 10 and 11, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. This should be great encouragement to us because this is a godly woman, and what she's showing here is that weeping and worship are not at odds with each other. She comes to the Lord in her pain. She comes to the Lord in her frustration. She comes to the Lord in her bitterness. She comes to the Lord in her anger. She comes to the Lord with this sense of, that's not fair. And she prays. That's authentic faith. That is actually coming to God in a respectful manner because we're admitting, God, I don't get it. I don't understand it. This doesn't feel right or feel good, but I'm trusting you because I'm coming to you and I'm pouring out my complaint before you. And then she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord, and all the days of his life no razor shall touch his head. So here, Hannah takes a bold step because the verses from Ecclesiastes should be running around in your mind right now where he says, you better pay what you vow. It's better to not vow at all than to vow and not pay. And right now, she's heightening the stakes. She makes a vow before the Lord and says, Lord, if you will do this for me, I will commit what is most precious in my life to you. It's the same attitude that Abraham had when God, after decades of infertility for Sarah, had finally given them a son, the one and only son Isaac. And then God comes and says, Abraham, you must sacrifice Isaac, because he's testing Abraham's faith. And Abraham goes and he brings Isaac up on the mountain and he sets him before the Lord. What was most precious to Abraham, he puts it all out before God, and then the Lord says, I make the payment. I'm not requiring the payment from you. I make the payment. I provide. And so that's what Hannah is doing with open hand. She's saying, Lord, I long for this son. And this would have been most precious to her, the child that would have removed her shame, removed her reproach, moved her into a new social status. What would be most precious to her, she's offering it to the Lord. And we know that Hannah makes good on this vow, for this child is the prophet Samuel. And he is the one that leads the people of God, pretty much leads them up to receiving King David, because she's authentically living before the Lord and saying, whatever is most precious to me, I will give to you. And that is what Hannah is calling us to as well, is what is most precious to us to give to the Lord and live authentically before him. But the hope that we have is that God gave what was most precious to him to us. Because he doesn't really demand the payment from us. He provides. It says in Romans chapter 8, it says, God, who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? See, God the Father gave up what was most precious to him, his own son. And if we think about the greatness of Jesus, we see that Jesus was the perfectly innocent one, the blameless one, the sinless one, and he experienced the injustice and oppression of life. He should not have been condemned, but he was, because he never did anything wrong. There was no reason to bring charges against Jesus, but he experienced the injustice and the oppression of sinful and wicked men. But he experienced that injustice, he experienced that oppression, he experienced that brokenness for you and for me. See, our God is not detached and aloof from this world, but he got involved. He took his own medicine. He saw humanity in our plight, and he met us right there through the sacrifice of his son. And so when we experience the unfairness of life, we can look to Jesus, who was the just, but he died for the unjust, which is each one of us. And he now invites us into this relationship with himself, that we can be washed clean of our sin, made new, forgiven, brought into his family, and then given a new purpose, a new significance, a new mission in our lives, to be that force of good in the world. And even though it's hard, and even though we will experience the unfairness of the world, we can persevere, because we are not working for our own glory, but we are looking to shine the light and the glory of God in the world.